Human Rights Are Not for Black Peoples, Understandings of International Human Rights Discourses by Young Adults in Tigray During War and Genocide. From the Journal of Contemporary Issues in Education, Volume 20, Number 2, December 2025, Special Issue. Abstract. In November 2020, a war broke out between the fascist Oromo Islamic Regime and the Tigray region in northern Ethiopia. This two-year period of extreme violence resulted in between 800,000 to 1 million Tegaru deaths, a communications blockade, sexual violence and starvation used as weapons of war, and an Ethiopian government-imposed siege around Tigray to prevent entry of humanitarian aid. This study, co-designed by 3 Tegaru researchers and 1 non-Tegaru researcher, explored the experiences of young Tegaru adults, aged 18 to 25, during the early stages of the war. The findings in this paper are from semi-structured one-on-one interviews held in August/September 2022 with 9 men and 9 women and follow-up one-on-one interviews in January/February 2023, all of whom were living in the Tigray capital city of Mekelle. Participants shared their experiences related to the violence, siege, and blockade imposed by the Ethiopian government during this period. Notably, most participants expressed strong condemnation of the actions taken by the international community, especially given the discrepancy as to how the international community responded to the Russia-Ukraine war, which began in February 2022, 15 months after the conflict and genocide against Tigray began. Using the colonial matrix of power as a theoretical framework, this article shares Tegaru understandings of the international community's response to the war and genocide in Tigray and Tegaru demands that international organizations and nation-states put into action the human rights discourses they purport to support, demonstrating a desire for a universal practice of international human rights, one that does not privilege groups based on race or wealth. In not living up to these claims of the universality and neutrality of international human rights, international organizations and Western nation-states illustrated that human rights remains the domain of one particular subset of peoples, those with Eurocentric systems of knowing and being, who are seen as the true inheritors of the earth. These logics then destroy all other ways of knowing and being, and such acts become a production of invisibility wherein Tegaru lives are considered dispensable. Literature Review. The war on Tigray began in November 2020, resulting in a devastating humanitarian crisis. Despite the urgency of the humanitarian crises, the international response has been significantly weak. The Tigray war has resulted in widespread human rights abuses, mass displacement, and conditions of famine. Over 5 million people required urgent humanitarian aid, yet starvation was weaponized as a tool of war. One of the most alarming aspects of the Tigray crisis is the systematic denial of aid. Reports indicate that Ethiopian and Eritrean forces imposed deliberate blockades, preventing humanitarian agencies from delivering essential supplies, which resulted in catastrophic consequences. During this time, another major international crisis broke out. The February 2022 invasion of Ukraine by Russia represents one of the largest and fastest refugee movements witnessed in Europe since the end of World War II. This invasion prompted remarkable actions from the international community, with the United Nations, UN, at the forefront among various responding agencies. Several studies highlight how the UN mobilized its vast resources and networks to tackle the complex crisis, while other international organizations and regional bodies provided crucial yet supplementary assistance. As Martin, Wu, and Yakimova point out, the international humanitarian response to the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine was immediate. On February 24, 2022, the UN allocated $20 million from the Central Emergency Response Fund to facilitate life-saving humanitarian interventions. By the end of the year, the Ukraine Flash Appeal, which was coordinated by the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, UNOCHA, raised $3.73 billion to provide emergency shelter, essential supplies, and cash assistance to millions of displaced and vulnerable individuals. Key UN agencies played important roles in implementing this response. While the UNHCR prioritized emergency housing and protection for displaced populations, aiding millions with shelter and essential items, UNICEF focused on the needs of children through healthcare, education, and access to clean water. The World Health Organization, WHO, supplied critical medical resources. Additionally, the World Food Programme, WFP, addressed food insecurity, worsened by disruptions to agricultural production and trade due to the war, while the UN Population Fund, UNFPA, ensured access to reproductive health services for women and girls. Support for Ukraine continues as the war enters its fourth year, with ongoing assistance from the UN and other international humanitarian organizations. Despite these two conflicts having overlapping timelines, international responses differed significantly. Schinkenberg et al.'s evaluative report and Annis et al. Highlight that only a fraction of needed aid reached Tigray, with less than 10% of requested assistance making it through during the peak of the crisis, addressing less than a quarter of those in the most severe need. Furthermore, aid workers faced extreme restrictions, arrests, and violence while attempting to access affected populations, and the UN OCHA disclosed 131 humanitarian violations perpetrated by the Allied forces in 2021. On the other side of the world, since February 2022, international actors have allocated over $100 billion to support Ukraine, with $20 billion designated for humanitarian efforts. In contrast, less than $2 billion has been mobilized for Tigray, failing to meet even half of the required humanitarian assistance. On the other hand, diplomatic responses to the situation in Ukraine have varied considerably, with the United Nations swiftly condemning Russia's invasion and the General Assembly adopting a resolution that demanded an immediate withdrawal while citing violations of the UN Charter, UN Press, 2022. However, the passage of binding resolutions was hindered by Russia's veto power in the Security Council and the abstentions of key states like China and India. Beyond the UN framework, NATO and the EU took on a strategic role, focusing on military aid, logistical support, and economic sanctions to undermine Russia's war efforts while ensuring the stability of global energy and food supplies. This underscores the UN's effective leadership in addressing the crisis in Ukraine, successfully coordinating humanitarian and diplomatic responses. In contrast, in Tigray, international actors remained largely silent, even after Ethiopia expelled UN officials under unfounded accusations of interference. The disparity in aid stems from geopolitical priorities rather than humanitarian needs. Humanitarian aid is fundamentally defined as urgent, impartial, and principled assistance for those affected by crises. The reality, however, is often more complex. Kase describes the core principles of humanitarian aid as saving lives, alleviating suffering and upholding human dignity regardless of race, nationality, or political beliefs, which is often challenged by political interests, geopolitical priorities, logistical constraints, and systemic inequities. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs argues that the international response to Ukraine demonstrates that rapid mobilization of aid is possible when there is political will. However, the global community's lack of attention to Tigray raises critical ethical questions. Are Tigrayan lives valued less by the global community? Has the prioritization of geopolitical and ideological interests overshadowed the humanitarian responsibility to protect all civilians equally? Such an outcome represents a catastrophic failure of the international humanitarian response and implies systemic biases in global aid support and distribution. This, in turn, calls for action that humanitarian aid should be provided based on need rather than political considerations. In a nutshell, the international response to the wars in Ukraine and Tigray highlights a significant disparity in attention and intervention. The conflict in Ukraine prompted swift and substantial support from Western nations, including military aid, financial assistance, diplomacy, and extensive media coverage, largely due to its geopolitical implications for Europe. In contrast, the Tigray War, despite being one of the deadliest conflicts with severe humanitarian consequences, was met with relative neglect by the global community. Analysts argue that this imbalance reflects a racial and geopolitical hierarchy that undervalues African crises. Even more troubling is the focus of the Western world on the Ukraine war has influenced world decision-making and public opinion regarding the war in Tigray. Such selective humanitarianism exposes troubling inconsistencies in how the world responds to human suffering based on location and perceived strategic importance. Theoretical framework: the colonial matrix of power. Historically, colonialism refers to the practice of domination over a people, their knowledges, their culture, and the appropriation and exploitation of their wealth, labor and natural environment. Referring to previously colonized peoples and/or lands as existing in peripheral zones, Grossvogel states that they remain in a colonial situation even though they are no longer under a colonial administration. These ongoing colonial situations and the perpetuated inequalities are referred to as coloniality. Maldonado Torres concurs, stating that while colonization was supposed to be a matter of the past, more and more movements and independent intellectuals, artists, and activists are identifying the presence of coloniality everywhere. As examples of the ubiquitousness of coloniality, Maldonado Torres points out that it is maintained alive in books, in the criteria for academic performance, in cultural patterns, in common sense, in the self-image of peoples, in aspirations of self, and so many other aspects of our modern experience. In a way, as modern subjects we breathe coloniality all the time and every day. This article speaks to the experiences of Tegaru peoples in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, a land that is considered to have never been colonized by European or Western powers despite attempts by the Italians to do so. However, despite this history, the response of the international community to the war and genocide in Tigray can best be understood as a function of the colonial matrix of power. The colonial matrix of power framework emerged from the conceptualization and theorization of Anibal Quijano's work on the coloniality of power. Mignolo describes the colonial matrix of power as a machine which produces injustices and inequalities. As an organizing principle, the colonial matrix of power is founded on the ideas of race and racial classifications, and such practices of control, exploitation, and domination have become naturalized as objective and scientific notions. Mignolo proposes that the colonial matrix of power framework can be used to uncover and analyze the relationships of power and inequalities that exist in all societal structures. For this paper, 3 dimensions of the colonial matrix of power, the coloniality of power, the coloniality of knowledge and the coloniality of being, will be operationalized to understand the failure of human rights discourse during the war and genocide in Tigray. Coloniality of power. The foundational concepts underpinning the coloniality of power are domination, control and management of labor, sex, subjectivity, and authority. Germana suggests that with the process of colonization, there emerged a model of power that allowed the colonizers to imagine themselves as superior, the future, and modern, to name themselves white, and to imagine colonized peoples as inferior, backwards, and worthless, and name them according to their skin color. This binary of racial superiority/inferiority became core to sustaining the model of power exerted by the colonizers. Quijano, 2000. Not only were colonized people naturalized as inferior due to their skin color, their cultures, traditions, knowledges, and beliefs were also made inferior in the same way. The domain of coloniality of knowledge refers to the epistemic dimension of the colonial matrix of power. The concept uncovers how knowledge is classified and hierarchized and to analyze how Western-produced knowledge has come to be made legitimate, superior, and universally accepted and how all other knowledge systems have come to be considered inferior and pre-scientific. The promotion and domination of a single worldview, or a hegemonic episteme, reinforces and privileges concepts such as universalism, neutrality, and delocalized knowledge. The current Eurocentric systems of knowledge and knowledge production impose themselves as the only true ways of knowing the world. Concurrently, these logics almost always violently marginalize, subalternize, and destroy all other forms of knowledge, especially those of formerly colonized and/or of indigenous peoples. Mignolo, 2007. Not only are knowledges held by formerly colonized and indigenous peoples erased from existence, the knowledge bearers are also subjected to the same violent marginalization, destruction, and erasure processes. Conceptualization of the coloniality of being developed as a response to questions around the impact of coloniality on colonized and indigenous peoples' lived experiences. In conceptualizing this dimension of the colonial matrix of power, Maldonado Torres encourages reframing Descartes' foundational philosophical principle, cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, to expose its underlying assumptions and connections to coloniality of being. He states that Descartes' principle is better interpreted as, I think, others do not think, or do not think properly, therefore I am, others are not, lack being, should not exist or are dispensable. Ndlovagachini concurs and suggests that Descartes' principle creates divisions by placing people into zones of being, those that can think, therefore, should exist, and zones of non-being, those that cannot think, therefore, should not exist. The zone of non-being is a psychological space where oppressed and marginalized peoples are regarded as subhuman objects, where they are not allowed to have a voice or be fully human, and where they are denied the right to exist as human beings. Essentially, the coloniality of being addresses colonized and indigenous peoples' identities as human and promotes the notion that if people's humanity is in doubt, then they do not have to be viewed as human. This logic formed the basis for the displacement, eradication, and genocide of many colonized and indigenous peoples around the world, as these peoples were not considered fully human and, therefore, were dispensable. All dimensions of the colonial matrix of power framework interact and are intertwined, and they work together to uphold and to perpetuate the logics of coloniality, and the underlying logics of racial distinction in present society, including how human rights discourses and law operate as an extension of violent colonial relations of power grounded in white supremacy and Eurocentric systems of knowing and being. The colonial matrix of power framework exposes the logics of coloniality which continues to violently oppress formerly colonized, indigenous, and marginalized peoples.